I'm Chris Valhopoulos. I'm the practice area lead for clean tech and sustainability. I've been with Scott Madden now since '91, a long time in consulting years. I started out UNC MBA, started as an associate, and so I was where you guys were just a couple of years ago. So what have you guys covered so far? Stuart's done the energy overview. Corporate shared services.
Change management.
Change management.
We did COP.
COPs. Okay.
We did Concur.
Oh, that was fun, wasn't it? Not everything about not everything about this job is the greatest, but necessary evil, as as James tells me. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over clean tech, and part of what we'll go over is the landscape. What do we mean by clean tech, and what exactly is it? Also talk a little bit about what do we do in clean tech, and how do we get involved in. You guys have talked about the COPs and how we operate within clean tech for the COPs, and leave some time at the end for questions. So please ask questions along the way, though. It's a small room, small group. Let's just make this interactive. Particularly the word sustainability, it really means like anything to anybody. What we call clean tech and sustainability, and you'll hear people joke about this, there are three things that we stake out within Scott Madden as clean tech and sustainability. The first thing is clean and renewable sources of energy. The second one is smarter uses of energy. And the third is more traditional enterprise sustainability. So what we mean by that is, so clean and renewable sources of energy, decarbonizing and cleaning of the energy. Wind, solar, nuclear, because nuclear is carbon-free, emission-free, biofuels, biomass. And there's renewable and clean don't always go together. There's an argument over bio as to whether it's necessarily all that clean, but definitely renewable. Nuclear arguably is not renewable, but definitely clean. Wind and solar, big happenings. In our industry, in the electric sector, big push towards solar and wind. That's what our clients are, particularly solar. Smart energy management, that's the next piece of clean tech, is how do we better use energy, energy efficiency, demand management, storage. Big interest out there in, the old way was pretty dumb system. Internet of Things. This is where you're getting the Googles and everybody, and the Google Nest, controllable thermostats, putting intelligence into how we use energy. Our electric utility clients are particularly interested. This is a big growth area. The traditional enterprise sustainability, it's interesting, if you go to sustainability conferences these days, 75% of it is around the first two. The whole idea of the more traditional sustainability of the circular economy and that sort of thing is a little more narrow, and we're kind of figuring out how to play in this space. But there are examples like water. Water would fall into this, particularly for our utility clients. Water availability, water reliability is a big issue. What do we do? So our strategy, we're not a solar developer. We're not, there are some people that are deeper in wind. There are some people that are deeper in solar, some people that are deeper in energy efficiency. But we sort of stake out our spot as no one is able to help our utility clients connect the dots better. And as an example of that, we had a client that wanted to understand community solar. We knew a little bit about it, but the issue was, okay, so how does that fit with our market? With our rate structure? What do the developers need if we as the utility wanted to encourage it? What levers can we pull? How do who does the programs? So we were hired to help them. They said, we're confused. We need somebody to help us pull this together. So we even brought in some community solar providers. We did rate analyses, those sorts of things. We help them connect the dots. How does this work for us? Does that make sense? So that's kind of our, when we say clean tech and sustainability, now that's leaves a big hole. What do we do? And we'll talk about that later, but this is sort of the market area that we're focusing on. So if you talk about the reality of clean generation, this is a chart showing production of sources of energy. Let me see, do we have a... Yeah. So coal has been dropping off, right? Nuclear holds its own. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of plants drop off. That's a concern. What traditionally has been the biggest clean energy source has been hydro, and then the wind, and then all of the others. They're starting to pop up. The green, natural gas, right? That's one of the biggest changes is everything's converting over to cheap natural gas. Good for for carbon emissions, lower than coal. Still not zero, but what you're really seeing is a switch to natural gas. If you focus on the renewables, so what really, when you look at those lower end, the biggest, again, the biggest producer is wind. Wind among the renewables, once you take away the traditional hydro, all the hydroelectric plants that we've had before, the big growth has been in wind, big, huge wind farms, and those produce a ton of power. Biomass has been sort of steady. That's kind of a big surprise to people to think of all the bio plants that are out there. Utility scale solar and is the blue, and then the distributed solar PV has been the other big growth area. Go ahead.
Why is the wind so volatile? And even the last slide, why are they so jagged?
All right, now you're stumping me. The it's the seasonality of the wind resources. You'll get similar in sun. In sun, summer obviously is better than winter for the solar resource. For the wind, remind me, what are the shoulder?
Fall and winter, I think.
Yeah. It's the seasonality of when we get the winds. I've never really looked at it. That's a great question. But one of the things that points out too is, and we'll talk about it later, is the word Stuart might have talked about, dispatchable versus non-dispatchable resources. These things run when they want to run. The coal and the natural gas and the nuclear run when we want them to run. You've got, in particular, you've got these tax credits, the investment tax credit that solar tends to take advantage of, and the production tax credit that wind gets 2 cents a kilowatt hour for every one it produces. So it doesn't have, it covers a pretty good bit of its costs right away. It gets it in the form of a tax credit. For solar, they tend to do it on the investment and collect it right up front for the asset. So they'll get their investment tax credit. There's also modified accelerated recovery, accelerated tax depreciation. So what happens when you put these deals together, it ends up being less about utility people and developers. It's the finance, it's the Wall Street guys putting together people with tax appetite, with people, with the monies to create these deals, and they work. What you see in North Carolina, in particular, is PURPA qualified facilities where utilities are required to buy power at an avoided cost. North Carolina had a very simple program that allowed a lot of solar to come in and say, utility, you have to take it. You don't even have to negotiate the deal. The deal is the deal, and they take it. So that's one of the things. You'll hear about net energy metering. Some states have gone for personal solar, is you're allowed to sell back to the grid at your full retail rate. Even though you're producing, in a sense, wholesale energy, you get paid at whatever rate, full retail, which includes generation, distribution, customer service, administrative costs. So in some places, Arizona, you get paid 15, 18 cents a megawatt hour, or kilowatt hour, even though your generation value is much, much lower. The whole idea was, let's incent people to put these on. Let's build the business. So there's a number of things. What's really driven, and then these are the states that have those programs. And that's what's driven a lot of this, a lot of the adoption. Wind, again, it's interesting. If this is a map of the wind resources, that's where most of the good wind is, right in the middle of the country. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of people live in that part of the country. So you have to get that, you got to get the power out. And here's a map of the transmission system. That's not where all the transmission is. So some of the issues you'll hear, as you work here, is the issues of transmission to get renewables, integrating those renewables to allow them to get to where they need to be. There's a Clean Line as a company that's trying to build one into the southeast to bring some of that, the wind energy in, bring it in from where it is here all the way down into Southern Company and TVA. It's not an easy thing to do either environmentally. What do people protest against? Big power lines coming through, their area. So again, wind, the other thing, wind blows at night, land-based wind blows at night. And overnight is usually when people are asleep and not using that much power, which is why offshore wind has a great appeal. The winds for offshore wind tend to be more stable throughout the whole day. Unfortunately, offshore wind's very expensive right now, so we really don't have, other than the first one up in the Northeast, not a real big prospect for offshore wind. Photovoltaic, you'll hear about two different kinds. The one that works mostly is PV, photovoltaic. Sun hits the panel, the solar panel generates the energy, the electricity. The other is concentrated solar, where a lot of mirrors reflect the sun onto a medium that stores the heat, the fluid in a fluid, and then runs a more typical cycle of a power plant. Essentially, you read the environmental downsides of some of these. Wind, one of the big environmental downsides is birds, bats, things fly into the turbines, get killed. If you can imagine a bird flying through where all those solar panels, they fry the birds just instantaneously. That thing, imagine, can be, I don't know how many thousand degrees it is, but the nice thing about this is you can actually, though, physically store the heat for longer periods. Sun goes away, you still have the heat, and can still be used later to generate the electricity. Here, sun goes away, the power goes away. And again, your power profile starts when the sun comes up and goes away when the sun goes down. And then when clouds come during the middle of the day, you lose a little bit of the power. But once you got, the nice thing about this, once you have them out there, there's really nothing other than occasionally washing them off and cutting the grass underneath them. They'll sit out there for 20 years and produce power. The inverter, which takes the DC power off the panel and it makes it AC to feed the grid, is probably the one 10-year life that you'll replace the power electronics. Otherwise, if they don't break, they just sit out there. And solar is enjoying, again, significant growth because you can imagine something like that is, once you figure out how to install these things, it's a pretty simple technology. Questions on any of that so far? Anything?
Why is it going down into 2018 and then spiking back up?
These have a lot to do with the tax credits. We've had it where they're going to expire, so everybody builds, and then at the last minute they save the tax credits, so they come back, and so you get these rushes. Also, they tend to be, if you looked at it quarterly, they all get installed in December to get the tax credit for the year. So that's been a big piece of this. Wind in particular has seen that because there was a cliff on the ITC and everybody was trying to get these things installed to take advantage.
Chris, you mentioned there might be little O&M, like vegetation management, cleaning, and the inverter replacement from time to time. Have companies that installed a number of sites come up with the playbooks like we've done for generation and nuclear facility,
I think
have they done operational playbooks?
More so in wind, where you have a lot of inspections, and I do think, yes, they are getting to where, and the other thing they're trying to do is design for operability too. Is we've heard a guy, a panel talk about this at a conference of even how you design them so that people can get in and fix the inverter when it breaks, or find where the problem is in a huge field of solar panels. Something's not working. How can you quickly find it? He was saying, you could end up driving the field all day looking for the problem. So it's become a big issue for them is how do you design these so that you can monitor them, maintain them, fix. Most of it is fix rather than maintain, but what are those, even goes into the design standards. But you're right, wind, we did work with a wind company on their safety program and standards. You can imagine work at high elevations. What's your standard program? They had bought a bunch of wind farms from different companies, put them together. What are your programmatic standards for that? So you've got unsubsidized costs of energy. You can see particularly utility scale. Wind is more mature, so its cost declines are a little bit less. But what's been driving this is not just the incentives, but what the incentives were intended to do is let's get some momentum to where we can drive the costs down. This shows a couple things. One is the difference, how the costs are coming down. But you'll notice, if you're talking about residential systems, they're high cost, right? The fixed cost to install a system, and you've got a small system, and every house is different, and you've got to send a crew out there, and they can drive to the house and do it. Versus utility scale, where you can throw a large amount of capacity down in a lot cheaper. It's also what you can see too is you think about the actual photovoltaic module and the panel, particularly in residential. That's not what ends up being the biggest cost. Those costs have come down so far. It's really the other things, including the design, permitting, financing, customer acquisition, balance of systems. And so if you think about it, that's stuff when you're working with clients, you know, that tends to be things you think about in replicable playbook. How do you drive down the costs of those other things? Not necessarily the panels, but how can you get the installations and financing costs? That's where the next round of reductions will come. And what you can see is, utility scale wind and solar unsubsidized are starting to be very, very, very competitive. Now this is absent, what we're going to talk about is integration costs. This is when they work. Problem is, they don't work all the time, so you need something else there to match it with so that it can, so that you can get your power all day long. But if you talk about the subsidies themselves, it makes it even better. And the big gas combined cycle is the only other competition in town right now for new megawatts. Residential, while you get the advantage of the rooftops already there, it's a pretty expensive way to generate electricity.
Would corporate, so like I know Walmart is making a push to, is that considered residential? Like they're making a push to put more on their roofs? Is that kind of?
There's two ways the corporates, and it's a good point. What's driving a lot of this too are the corporates, and they're doing it in two ways. And the term you'll hear in the sustainability world is additionality. Has anybody heard that? They want to be able to say that by buying the energy, they added to the renewables. In the early stages, they'd buy renewable energy certificates and said, we bought offsets, we bought certificates off of an existing. What they want to do is say they've done it. So they'll either do a C&I rooftop, commercial industrial, on their facilities, not quite as good as a utility scale, or they will sponsor a new build of a facility. So in eastern North Carolina, we got our very first wind farm. Pretty good size one. Amazon signed for the power for a facility up in the DC area. And so that facility wouldn't have been built if Amazon hadn't agreed to be the off-taker for the power. So what you'll hear is corporate purchase power agreements or also corporate installations. But more so, the bigger impact is the sponsoring of the new facility. So the Amazon wind farm out in eastern North Carolina. So the issue, we talk about so those are the prices, but then why can't we just, if it's that good, why aren't we doing so much of it? The problem is, so if you think about solar, this is a typical load profile. Did Stuart talk a little bit about the duck curve and all that? So I won't go too far, but the issue becomes, if we get it all during the middle of the day, we still have to have things around to serve the other parts of the day. And this may be very cheap here, but the problem for the plants that are running below this dash line, which is sort of the base load, those are high fixed cost, low marginal cost plants. So when you take hours away from them, they just get more and more expensive. It's not like you saved anything because they're there. Nuclear plants are there, they're running. There's no real marginal cost. So you've taken cheap power, replaced carbon-free nuclear power with carbon-free solar power, use it later. The other is, can we fill the belly? Can we have demand? Let's let all of our water heaters run during the middle of the day rather than later. Let's charge our electric vehicles. This gets into that smarter uses of energy. This looks like this if we don't do anything about it. But we could do something about it. We could manage we could manage to, we always thought we'd charge our EVs at night when everybody was asleep, but now we're beginning to think maybe this is when we charge them. When we have all this excess energy, let's soak it up and then we won't use it here. Questions? Make sense? Did Stuart say anything different? Anything better?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So how does this look from a consulting side? Like, does a client ask you about how to deal with using their solar energy, and then you come in and tell them about the duck curve, or what does that kind of interaction look like?
It's a good question. It's a good question. And so I think it kind of comes into is the conversation starts there, and we always have to be thought leaders about this stuff, right? That, you know, hey, have you considered this? North Carolina, have you considered this? And then it might end up being, well, it could go down a couple paths. One is, boy, we hadn't thought about this. Maybe we ought to do a little study about it. The other way it could end up is they're hearing this from all sorts of people, but it may spin off something that then they feel they can't do. So maybe it might get, you know, I remember you talking about the water heater thing. We need to put some people together and figure out how to do that controllable water heater program. Do you know anybody that does that? Or storage? So it can be at different levels. We did have, one of the projects we did, Copenhagen and Infrastructure Partners, multi-billion-dollar fund that's investing in the electric space. They wanted to invest in solar in North Carolina. And they were looking at all sorts of projects. And they said, hey, you guys, we don't understand this market. You need to help us understand the market. So we did a project for them, telling them, here's how North Carolina works. Here's a part that's in PJM. Here's how the regulated utility market works. Here's how solar gets built. Whole lot of conversations, and we talked a little bit about the duck curve and how even though North Carolina doesn't have what you would consider the issues that California has, all the solar in the queue is going to cause these problems. They came back a couple months later and said, we're a little worried about that duck curve and whether our projects are going to, you know, whether Duke will renege on them, because if this happens, it might make our projects vulnerable. Can you do a deep dive in that and tell us what really might happen in North Carolina? So we went in and said, of all the projects that are proposed, how deep will it go? What is the real situation? So they did it a little bit as a risk management study of what do we really face here? So I don't think, you know, we rarely get these big picture, all right, duck curve, do a big study. I think they tend to be the spin-offs where we want to, what we want to be is the thought leaders and be ahead of the curve to know these things so that when they run across the issues, they know who to call. So all this duck curve stuff, the people from First Solar called us up and said, hey, we've read your stuff. You need to come talk to us because we're solving some of these problems. And you guys need to understand how we're solving some of these problems so you can tell your utility clients how we're solving these problems. And they were around how to better operate. You know, we talked about we could better use demand, and their point is you don't need natural gas to be ready to ramp fast. There are ways we can operate these solar facilities better, and you need to understand that. So there's a bit of that. Ultimately, what we do tends to be not much different in these areas than we do for the rest of energy. It's just what we bring to our clients are a deep understanding of the issue so that we can quickly help them. This was an area that looked very promising at one time, but frankly it's a bit dead these days with low with low gas prices and attention turned to other places, renewable fuels. We had a lot of projects. We were the market consultant for DOE loan guarantee applications. We did about 10 or 12 of them. And so we got into renewable fuels, biofuels, advanced ethanol, and things like that. And similar to clean energy standards, they have the renewable fuel standard. How many are aware of the renewable fuel standard? Have you ever gone up to a gas station and a little sticker it says up to 10% may be ethanol? Well, that's the rule. They set a rule that every, the gasoline companies had to blend 10%, up to 10% ethanol, and they set billion-gallon targets for them, both traditional, conventional corn-based ethanol, advanced ethanols with, we did one with corn stover, all the leftover corn stalks that could be turned into ethanol. And these are renewable fuels. Back when gas prices were high and we're going to run out of oil. The other interesting thing is, just like electricity, since about 2008, the use of gasoline's kind of peaked. I don't know if people know that, but it was growing, and it's really sort of leveled off, which has made this a big issue because they set the standards assuming people will keep using gas. It's not. The standards keep going up, and the auto companies, this is an interesting one, they call it the blend wall. Once you get beyond 10%, they think it's bad for cars, unless you have some of your cars say E85 or something on it, which can go up to higher percentages of ethanol. They're really against pushing beyond 10% because of the infrastructure they have. But with the amount of gasoline staying the same and the number of gallons of ethanol that have to be blended in, they're reaching that blend wall, and it's become a big argument among the petroleum companies. When we started the clean tech practice, this seemed to be very, very promising. Not so much these days. Again, why nuclear and clean tech? If you look at emission-free electricity sources, we see wind as the big player in the renewables, but traditionally nuclear has been the workhorse for carbon-free electricity. We do a ton of work in nuclear over the years. Nuclear is big for us because you have large organizations, big issues. This is general management consulting, not nuclear consulting, but if you get 1,000 people on a site in a plant, getting them all lined up and doing what they need to be doing is traditional management consulting. But we're very, low natural gas prices. I don't know if you read a lot, but in this industry, but every other week they're saying one more nuclear plant is at risk of shutting down because they can't make any money these days. 3 Mile Island just announced last week that they were going to shut down if they don't get any relief. So here's, I don't know if you knew where they all are. This is where all the nuclear plants are. Mostly East Coast. Not a whole lot here. Not a whole lot of people there. The red circle ones are the ones that are going away unless, and even more, Illinois has stepped up, and so has New York, to come up with a clean energy standard that's going to allow nuclear to get the same kind of support that that some of the renewables get. But the green are the new ones. They're actually trying to build the new ones. Vogtle and they didn't, that should go over Vogtle. Summer and Vogtle are way over budget. Has anybody read about Westinghouse and Toshiba going bankrupt? SCANA, right? It was your fault, right? Did you work on any of that?
I manage the risk portfolio on the insurance side for
Yeah.
2 and 3.
Unfortunately, nobody's built one in a very, very long time, and it showed. They're really struggling. We've got a group down at Summer right now, trying to help them sort it out and figure out whether and how to go forward. They trust, they basically used an all-in cost model, trusted that Westinghouse knew what they were doing, and it turns out they didn't. So those things have got to go well, or the industry will be dead for a very, very long time, and will be with low prices. There won't be another one built for a while.
Were other countries building any nuclear facilities in the past decades?
Yeah,
So
why?
why didn't they hire those?
It's a great question, and even Westinghouse is doing some of that
Yeah.
overseas. Now, the question is, are any of them going well? Relatively not that great. Even there's one being built in UAE. The Koreans are building, and last rumor is that one's running into some delays as well. These are not easy things to build. The hope was Summer and Vogel would it'd be a lost leader for Westinghouse and those guys. They'd learn how to build them, and then they'd start stamping them out here in the U.S. At the time, natural gas prices were $10, and power prices were high, and we needed capacity and growth, and then 2008 hit, and then fracking hit, and it just tanked. And so it's a totally different world. Again, nuclear cost structure, you're really talking about operations and maintenance, which is people and processes and management. So they're very difficult to operate. They also need consulting help to continue to keep organizations and plans moving. I mean, there can be 750 to 1,000 people on a site. This is just an example of an org chart, which again is what management consultants do. The smarter uses of energy, we talked about the storage is a big deal. What we're seeing is the flattening of the load growth. We used to get 2-3% load growth every year. We're now flat to declining. Big issue with our clients. How do you grow? How do you grow revenues? How do you survive in a market in which your product is flat to declining? Stuart probably talked a good bit about that. But storage is one of the key. If you're talking about changing the way in which you use energy, storage is getting huge. Lithium ion obviously is a big piece of that. And then the question is, will it be residential or will it be out in the system on a utility scale? And frankly, if you end up with an electric vehicle, it itself is a battery that can be used both ways. If it's sitting in your house charged up and you need to access it, you could use that as well. How long? Big issues with batteries are how much and how long. Most of the lithium ions are only a couple hours. I mean, you can't last a hurricane with a battery, but it can get you through some of the peaks and hours of the day that you need the power. And so what does it provide? If you have the behind-the-meter storage, it's interesting. This is where you get into, it's not just a thing, it does so many different things. It can provide for the system, it can provide voltage support, frequency regulation. It can make the system stable. For the utility, rather than build more wires, I might be able to have the storage device be there so that I don't need to pump as much power through during those peak times a day that I might have to add some more capacity. And then for the customer, you know, if I have time of use rates, I might be able to offset it and not use it when it's expensive and use it when it's cheap. So it can provide all those different. So is it a generation source? Is it a transmission? Is it a distribution? It can be any of those things. And you'll probably see it all over the grid once Elon Musk gets his gigafactory and gets everything cheap. And if we're a red, what are we going to do about it? And so how do we take sustainability from being something separate and make it more part of normal course of business, and drive much in the way we do things like safety? Safety doesn't buy us any revenue, but utility organizations in particular, right, really focus on safety. They drive it, they measure it, they reward for it. And so you would imagine when you get to, if you reframe that as, you know, as sustainability, there's always a workforce element, and there's always an element of our worker safety. So we're coming up with our own model here. This is what the COP's kicking around of what good looks like from initial to visionary approach. And if you get involved in the COP, this is where Freedom David and Teresa Perry are working to kind of help us frame this. So we're taking this out to our clients and try and get ahead of it. Again, we talked about water as well as an area. This is one we actually had a project teamed up with RTI, who had a model for water reliability. We went to one of our nuclear operators and said, hey, your plant's on a small river. Have you ever run any projections of what might happen 10 years from now and whether you'll have enough water to run your plant? So we ran a model. Luckily for them, it wasn't bad, but what they found out, the plant's in Illinois, they realized that what happens in Indiana is actually what's important. When it rains in Indiana, a couple days later, that's when they get their water by their plant. So they got some insights into that aspect. So again, here's some examples of the things we've worked on that relate. So what are the kinds of things that we do in clean tech? John, the first three are yours. You want to briefly say something about it?
Sure. So all of them are clean tech projects. The first one up there is McCarthy Renewables. McCarthy is actually a construction company. And what they are doing is we're seeing the growth in renewables, and they have built a lot of solar facilities. And so they're thinking how to grow their business by doing more renewable work. And so when you build one of these solar farms, there's a lot of engineering, procurement, and construction work. And so these are huge facilities, and they're moving into that space. They were actually asking us to help them find a company to acquire. And so they wanted to grow, and they wanted to grow through acquisition. And so obviously confidential, they're still probably going to look at that on hold. Alliant was the business case I told you about a bit earlier. Honeywell is, y'all are probably familiar with Honeywell. You think that they do thermostats. They also do engine parts. They're as big as GE. They're huge. A company that they bought a couple of years ago was a company called Elster Meters. Elster Meters produces AMI meters on the side of your house. And what Honeywell was trying to do was they were trying to get into the home. And so they've got thermostats inside the house. They've got the meter on the side of the house. They know how much electricity they use. And they were trying to figure out ways how to leverage that data. Now, are there other things that they could sell you? Are there other products that they could do? Are there ways that they could work with the utility to do energy efficiency or market other products? And so we were helping them think through their strategy and where they should market their different products.
I want to talk about the excellent energy storage strategy. And this kind of gets to what consulting projects can be like. It sounds solar strategy, right? Pretty impressive. And it was impressive. We were able to go in and help them with it. But what the project was is they have the distribution utilities off doing some storage. They had the generation company doing storage. They have a retail arm that was selling home storage. And the CEO got frustrated and goes, what is our company's position on storage? What are we doing? Are we duplicating? Are we missing? Are we overlapping? What are we spending our money on? So he asked the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy, pull this all together. And he turned to us and he said, Chris, we need your help. And what really turned into was, all right, how do we get everybody aligned on, first of all, okay, what's everybody doing? We had to inventory what was going on. We had to help pull it together. We had to come up with a framework. What should we be doing? Where are we overlapping? Where are we missing things? And so it got in even to the personalities of the people of helping pull together a coherent strategy, not necessarily thinking beyond what they'd thought, but how do you pull together and really bring together not just the information, but the organizations and get them to work together and agree to report out. One of our big things was, let's report out quarterly on our progress so we share with each other what we're doing, because the retail arm wasn't telling the utility arm, and trying to pull together so that they can be more effective as an enterprise. And as a side benefit, we learned a ton about storage, and those are the kinds of things our clients get us involved in, because they know we know enough. We may not be the storage experts, but they trust us. They know we can work with their organizations. They know that we understand them. They know we know a ton about this stuff, and that's why they ask us. That's why they ask us to do it. One other thing, we do a ton of these thought pieces that get us a lot of exposure to some of our clients that really make them think. The duck curve, we've done some on storage, fact-finding trips with SEPA to go see other places that are already ahead of us. A lot of generation of content coming out of that. It's a fun time to be in this business. And we've gotten ourselves heavily involved with some of the key organizations out there that drive clean energy in the U.S. Here's how we've set ourselves. How do you get involved? Here's how we set up our COP. We've got different towers. It's so broad you can't keep up with everything. So we've got the wind, solar, EV storage, DSM, sustainability. Freedom David's volunteered. She'll be leading that one. Meet quarterly. And one of the things we do is, and Paul has a group of people who are interested in this. We started this for the company. When I took over Cleantech, there's so darn much stuff out there, and I found myself reading so much stuff. I said, every time I'd see something in the midst of it that was, boy, this is interesting. People need to know this. We started just sending out a blurb. Hey, if you didn't notice, this just happened, and you ought to be aware of it. So we started creating these, and we send them out to the firm and say, I don't know if you saw it, like one of the latest ones, solar plus storage at less than 4 cents in, where was that, Tucson. It's like, holy crap, you need to know about that. That's big, because I think the last one was Hawaii at 14 cents. So you're down at, and they were saying it might be even as low as 3 cents because they don't have the details. But we'll send those out. And I know Paul's always looking for volunteers to participate in those things. So questions for me that you haven't asked?